welcome to week 10 of Jumpstart. Congratulations. We've made it to the last week. I hope all of you guys had a good time learning about database and just so far how to build a full-fledged full stack application. Right now, this workshop is focused on the final step, which is going to be deploying our application. So that anyone with the URL that we deploy it to would be able to have access to it. So today's lesson plan is we're going to talk about what it means to deploy a program. Then we're going to explain like why would you want to deploy a program. And then specifically the way that we're going to deploy a program is through Heroku. And we're going to explain what Heroku is, why we're going to use it, and then how to actually deploy our front end, back end, and database on Heroku. So what does it mean to deploy our program? So basically deploying a program, we could think of it as the act of making our program publicly accessible through the internet through a URL. A program that when a program gets deployed, it's running on either a remote or local server. And this server has a URL that gets mapped to it. So then when requests are made to this server, our program responds to it based off of how we programmed it to do it. So this server is in charge of performing all the different operations that we programmed it to do when any of those requests are made, such as our put, get, delete, or post request that we learned when we made our backend. So then why would we want to deploy a program in the first place? Like, why do we want to make it accessible to the internet? Well, first, we want it so that we could show off to our friends, family, or potential job recruiters. This is a good way to get your program, to showcase our program to others. And another way is to receive feedback from those friends, family, or whoever we want to see our program. This is a good way to see like the little things that we went wrong or some ways that we can improve it. And also like another case would be our program, like there's a variety of programs that we can make. And specifically like our program is similar to a Medium. So this is a program that needs to be accessible by a bunch of people in order for the application to work. So this is a great way to expose our application to a variety of people. So before this point, our application has been running locally on our machine. And if you remember, the URL for our program was localhost followed by a port number. But other people can't access our localhost because like as the name says, it's local to our machine, like our local machine server. So in order to fix this, it's when we have to use like remote hosting services like Heroku, which will create a public URL for us, which other people could use. So then what is Heroku? Heroku is a cloud platform that allows developers to quickly and easily deploy their applications for free. It's configured to handle a variety of programming languages and frameworks such as Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, like Go, a bunch of programming languages. And for our case, Heroku is a really great choice. Developers or any developer could upload their project to Heroku's deployment platform, and our application gets assigned to a URL. This URL is then waiting to respond to incoming requests that gets made to it. And in traditional cloud deployment platforms, so the reason Heroku is easy is because in traditional cloud deployment platforms, we developers have to manually configure like which operating system we want to deploy on, how like different deployment methods and procedures, and to map our URL to like our local server. And it's just a long and complicated process, but Heroku really simplifies this process for all of us. All developers have to do is just upload their code to Heroku, and then Heroku takes care of the rest for us. So then if we compare Heroku to other platforms, if you see, the main reason we're going to use Heroku is because it is easier to use than traditional cloud deployment platforms. And as we previously mentioned, it allows us to deploy our application for free. When you deploy your application, you're going to need some computing resources because essentially these these computers resources is what our program is going to use in order to like function, but these computing resources cost money. Therefore, like to even run a simple server with minimum like hardware capabilities could cost around $5 to $10 a month. But Heroku allows us to use these minimum computing resources for free with like some restrictions, such as like how much like RAM our server is going to have or how much storage it's going to have. But Heroku also gives us the capability to upgrade our computing resources if we have to use more RAM or CPU capabilities. So if you see on the left of the screen is a screenshot for DigitalOcean, which is another cloud deployment platform. And just to run a simple like baseline server with only 1 gigabytes of RAM, 25 gigabytes of storage costs around $5 a month. But Heroku, there's to the right in the right image, we have a free and hobby version, which is like in a real world sense, you wouldn't like if you work at a company or like something like that, like you're not going to use that free and hobby because of its limited capabilities. But for our case, it's good because we get to show our application off. It does have limited like computing resources, but it will be more than enough for our use case. So the way our application is structured, our front end and back end are separated, and our database is also separated from those, but it gets connected to our back end. But because they're separated, they're not dependent on one another, and they are developed in completely different like environments and tech stacks, such as like our front end had a different like local host port than our back end. And they each use like our front end, we developed it with React, and our back end, we use Java. So it's just completely different like programming languages, and they're just really loosely coupled. But because of this, we're going to have to deploy our front end and back end separately. But like, thankfully, because Heroku has great documentations on how to deploy our React front end and our Java back end. However, before we deploy any application on Heroku, we need to first install Heroku on our machine. To do that, if you look at the slide, there's a website called signup.heroku.com, which is through that website, you just have to create a Heroku account and just give it like your username and email and password, and you should be good to go. And then, so that is how we have to create an account on Heroku. After we create an account, then we have to install Heroku on our local machine so we could deploy it. But it's different for each operating system that you used. So we have a link as to how you can install Heroku based off of your operating system. So next is, so we have Heroku installed. Our next step is to deploy our front end. So to deploy our front end application, first we have to navigate to our front end directory. And then once we have to do that, we only have to do this step if we have not been working through a Git repository. So if you've just created a new React app and have just have been like writing code for it yourself, you haven't taken like none of our starter code and you haven't connected it to a Git repository, we're going to have to do that. So you just make sure you have Git installed on your machine, and then you could just run the commands git init to initialize our repository, and then git add period, which adds all our files from that directory into this Git repository. And then after we do that, we could call git commit -m with the message that we want to commit this to. And so that is how we have our program committed to Git. But now if you have been working with a Git repository, or if you did already take our starter code, then the next step that we have to do, so now we are all like in the same level. So the next step we have to do is we have to make sure that we're working in our master branch. So if you just created a Git repository, then you should already be in the master branch. But if you have a different branch, or if you've been working off different branches, then make sure you committed your code to that branch and pushed it. And then now we have to merge this branch into our master branch. So to do that, we could just run the command git merge master, which merges our current branch to the master branch, and then git checkout master, which is how we revert back to our master branch. And so once we do that, we are now ready to start deploying our front end. So to do that, the next step we're going to have to do is we're going to have to run the Heroku login command through the command line. If we already installed Heroku, then this should be ready to go. We shouldn't have any errors. So once we run Heroku login, you're going to get a prompt on the terminal to enter your username and password. And once you do that, you should get a message saying that you're now like logged into Heroku. And so the next thing that we have to do is we have to run like we have to create a project through Heroku. So we would go like stay in the same terminal window that we would be and just type in Heroku create, and we'd give it a name that we want to give it into like for our project. So in this case, it could be like front end like application, or like whatever you named your project's front end, whatever you want. And then we have to specify build pack Mars create React app. So what this is going to do is basically the last part is telling Heroku that the command that this application is going to be a React app. Usually Heroku automatically detects that it's a React application, but sometimes for some reason it doesn't. But this just ensures that we know that like Heroku already knows that it's going to be a React, and we could just avoid those errors for that. And so now that we have created our, we've updated our Git repository, we're making sure we're in our master, and we already logged into Heroku and created our application. The next step is to push to Heroku, so that we just run the command git push Heroku master. And so what this is going to do is it's going to push our current committed code that's in our master branch into Heroku's into Heroku. We're just sending, this is how we send the code to Heroku. However, if we're not in the master branch for some reason, there is a way to push the current branch that we're in. And to do that, you just run the command git push Heroku, but instead of saying master, you type in whatever branch you're in and then master. And so what this is going to do is it's going to push the current Git branch that we're on into Heroku, but Heroku's going to pretend that it's your master branch. That's what the master part in the end means. And so once we have that going, you should get a prompt in the terminal saying like a bunch of stuff like build deployed and just a bunch of Heroku messages. But in the end, you should get a Heroku like successfully deployed. And then it's going to give you a URL. And so now that URL is the URL that your front end code is like mapped to. And now anyone with that URL has access to your front end application. And so one way you could do like open this is you could copy and paste the URL from the terminal, opened a browser, and then paste the command in, or within Heroku, you could just run Heroku open, and this will automatically do that for us. And once you do that, you should see the loading page of our front end application. Like this is in the case of our starter code. This is the program that we've been working on. And so this should be the prompt that gets shown up on your browser. And so now we successfully deployed our front end. We have the user interface portion of our application, but with just this, we won't be able to add a new post or see any posts or anything, because all of that, we need the backend in order to have that functionality. So now we go on to deploy our backend. So for the backend, the first thing we have to do is notice our properties loader class. This is especially if you're looking at if you are looking at the starter code that we gave us. We have a class called properties loader, and what this class does is it examines our bunch of resources files that we have under our persist package in the resources folder. And what these properties do is it gets our database properties, such as like the database name and all those things. And it also gets the port number, which we're going to use to deploy our backend. This will come, so this comes in handy because when we deploy our backend to Heroku, Heroku's gonna, like, these properties loader classes get run. And this is how Heroku's gonna know like which port to open our backend in and know where our backend is located, or where our database is located, and perform our database operations for that. And so now, once we have noted these changes in our properties loader class, now the next step we have to do is we have to configure our application. So we have to navigate to our pom.xml file, which is in the root directory of our backend. And so far, our backend, we've developed it using Maven, which is a way to add structure like Java projects and add dependencies to it. I don't know if you recall earlier in earlier workshops, we talked about Maven and why we use it. And so one of the things that we do with Maven is we configure when we export our Java projects, we also export the dependencies that we added onto with Maven. And so these dependencies are just external code from other people or organizations that we use in our application. So up to this point, if we haven't had any problems running our backend locally, we should be okay to go. Like, this is just something that makes sure this is just a good opportunity to get rid of any dependencies that we're not using, or if we want to use a different version of a dependency, now would be the time to do that before we deploy it. But and so up to now we've been fine. One dependency that we do have to add ourselves to deploy our backend is the one that's located on the screen. And so this dependency is a dependency that copies all of our dependencies and puts them into a jar file. And so what a jar file is, it's a file that runs Java applications. We'll explain more about what exactly jar files are, but that's kind of how you could think of it. It's just it's like this file, and with that file, you could run your Java application. And so one thing to know is make sure this dependency is under the plugin parent tag in the POM XML file. And make sure you don't put it into the plugin management, because then it won't work and you will have a chance of having an error. So once our POM XML file is updated, the next step we have to do is configure something called a proc file. And we have to also configure a systems.properties file. So a proc file is a text file that is exclusively for Heroku, and it configures Heroku in a way so Heroku knows how to set up our Java application. And so in our proc file, it's just it's complicated and like long, but there's like a general structure that you could use. So what this means is it specifies, this proc file specifies that our application is going to use like the internet. It's a web application, which could be indicated by the web portion of the proc file. The Java section of the proc file specifies how to start up our Java application. And then the last portion of the proc file specifies how we're going to run our jar file, and which is how Heroku is going to Heroku's going to see this file when we deploy it, and it's going to know how the different configurations it's going to run our jar file and all of that. And so these jar files could be used to run Java application code anywhere, and it's easily exported. So this is a way for Heroku to know how to use our jar file. And so one thing we have to note is we have to note that our proc file has to be in the root directory. In the slides, the proc file is only the top portion of it. So that's one thing. The bottom image of the PowerPoint is going to be our systems.property file. And so what the system.property file means is it's just going to specify the Java version that we're going to be using. So in this case, like version 11, and what Maven version we're going to be using. Make sure that both of these files are in our, the proc file has to be in our root directory, and the systems.property file is also in our root directory with our proc file. It's different than, this system.properties file is different from a property file that we had in our resources folder under our service package, but because these ones are only meant for Heroku. So now that we have that, the next thing we have to do is we have to navigate to our backend project directory. And then we don't have to do this, but one command we could run is mvn clean install. And so this will clean up our application and build it again to make sure that we don't have any errors, especially after we added our new dependency and our proc file and system.properties file. And so after that, it gets pretty similar to how we deployed our front end. If we haven't committed our changes to our master branch, we just git add, and to add all the files that we updated, git commit -m with our message to commit those files. And so, and then after that, because we already deployed our front end, we should already be logged into Heroku, so we don't have to call Heroku login. So we could just go straight into typing Heroku create to create a new Heroku project. Remember how our front end back end is separate, so we have to create a brand new Heroku project. We can't use the same one as before. And so this would create a new Heroku project. And then the next thing we have to do is push our current project onto Heroku. And so we could do that by running git push Heroku master if we're in the master branch. And if we're not in the master branch, same as before, we could just run the commands git push Heroku, the name of the branch, and master in the end. And so this will push the designated git branch that we wanted. Again, before we do all this, make sure we're merged into master, it's just easier to deploy. It's not easier to deploy, but it's just good practice to recommend, because you should be deploying your best version of the application, which is usually the master branch. It's when you have already addressed all the fixes. So it's just a good practice to have to deploy from your master branch if it's ready. And then after that, the next thing we have to do is same as before. Heroku will run will show you a bunch of messages. It should say like build successfully and a bunch of other messages. And then after that, you should get a URL. And now this URL represents our backend for our application. And same as before, you can either copy and paste this URL and copy and paste it into a web browser, or you could run the command Heroku open. And if you do that, Heroku will show you a blank white screen with on the top left a message called hello Jumpstarters. And if you remember from our backend, from the root URL, if we make a request to that, that should be our response. And so that is a good way to verify that our backend has been successfully deployed and it's all working well. However, now our backend and front end are deployed, but we still can't, it's still not fully functional. And the reason why is we have to now change the request URLs that we're using in the front end to now use the URLs from the Heroku backend. And so to do this, Heroku has a feature in it called Heroku configuration files or Heroku secrets. And this is a way to write down important information, such as what URL our backend is going to make requests to. And these configuration, it's like a configuration that is like safe and secure, and other people usually can't access this information externally. So this is a good way to, this is a good use of a resource to type in what our URL is going to be, what URL our front end is going to use to make requests. So the next thing we have to do is we have to navigate into our front end application. And so after we do that, so we're in our front end directory in our local machine, and then we're going to type in the commands Heroku config set, and so request URL equals, and then whatever URL our backend is. So what this is Heroku is going to create a new configuration variable that's called request URL, and it's going to set that configuration variable equal to whatever value we give it. So the value that we're going to give it in this case is the backend URL that our backend is deployed in. And so after we do that, we now created a Heroku configuration variable. And so now we have to go into our React application and replace where we type in React app API domain with the value process.env.request URL. And so what this is we had like an environment variable in our React application called React app API domain, but this value was mapping to our local host URL that we were using for our backend. But now we're going to change that with process.env.request URL. And so what this is going to do is when this value gets hit, Heroku knows that, or like our front end knows that the value that we want is in our environment variables. And the variable that we want is the request URL environment variable, which is what Heroku has. So now that we have that, it's not completely fixed yet. Now we have to update our Heroku front end application with these new changes. So to do that, we just run the command git add to add all of our applications to it. And then to add like this new change to it. And then we run the command git commit -m to commit all these messages again. And then same thing as before, we push to our Heroku, either our master branch or the branch that we're currently on. And so now, after doing this, our front-end application should now be ready to receive incoming requests from our backend, and our backend is now fully deployed. So now we are in the last step, because now we have to configure our database. And so now that both the front end and the front end and the back end are now deployed, our database is the next step. So far, our database has been running locally on our machine, just like our front end and back end used to be. And because of this, no one had access to this data. So the next step that we have to do is deploy this using Heroku's built-in Postgres database. So Heroku it provides us a way to configure a Postgres database for us, which we could then use for our backend service. And so the next thing that like this is all like pre-built for us, like we should be like, okay, but now we have to like configure this database. So we go into our backend directory and we open up a terminal, and then we have to run something called a migration script. So this is a migration script is a command that will migrate our local database that we've been working with so far. And it's going to like push that database into the Heroku PostgreSQL database. And so to do that, we go into our source, persist, and resources and migrations directory within our backend. And once we're in there, we have to like go into Heroku's remote database. And to do that, like we have to like connect to it. We have to run our Heroku pg psql command. And so now when we do that, we should be in our Heroku like Postgres database like environment in it. And so now that we're there and we're also in our like backend directory in our migration script, we can now easily run those scripts with the commands -i, the name of the file, -SQL. So these migration scripts are just SQL commands that Heroku will run when we type this in. But to run a migration script, usually there's a bunch of different files in it. And so in the starter code, we had like script 1 or script 2. So we have to run each of those files separately, once for each time. Make sure to only run this once, that's important. And so once we finish running all the migration scripts, we should be okay. Our database has been migrated. And now the next step, which is optional, but it's a good way to see our database be like up and running, is a seeder script. And so what this is going to do is it's going to feed our database a bunch of like just data or information so that we could see if it's working properly. And so that we're not starting off with like a blank database for us. And so to do that, we go back to our backend directory and we go into our source /persist /resources /seeder directory or like folder. And we do the same thing as we did for our migration script, which is just running -i, the name of the file .sql. And we do that for each migration script for each seeder script that's there. And so once we're done running all our migrations and seeder scripts, our project has now been, like our database has now been configured and it's up and running. And so to leave the Postgres like like cloud that we've been like connected to this whole time. You just run the command -q, and so this will quit. Like it will return us back to like our normal terminal. We will no longer be like connected to that Heroku Postgres database. And so now we're there, and congratulations, we have successfully deployed our front end, back end, and database, and we are now running a fully fledged application on Heroku. We want to congratulate everyone for their incredible hard work and dedication that they've put in this last couple of weeks. We know it's been long, but we really hope that everyone had a lot of fun and learned a bunch of new things. And like, as always, if anyone has any questions, just do not hesitate to reach out to any one of us. We would all be more than willing to help you all. We know that deploying could be a tedious process, so we're here to help you along the way. Yeah.
Thank you, Juan. Great presentation. Like you said, I hope you guys learned something from that. We're going to be posting the video recording along with the script shortly after in the Slack channel. We'll still all be in the Slack channel if you guys are actually working on your projects and want some help with them. We're also going to be putting out kind of like larger feedback form for all Jumpstart that'll also have information about if you're interested in joining a C4C team, product team in the spring, probably on Monday. So just keep an eye out for that. Connor, is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, so along with the script and the video that we'll be sending out, we'll be sending out our versions of like the finished project. So you can use those for reference or whatever you need. And yeah, just thank you so much for joining us for all this. It was a real pleasure being able to work with you all.
All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for coming.